Hello and welcome to Dinis Guarda YouTube podcast show, powered again by openbusinesscouncil.org and citiesabc.com. As you know, this channel is always pushing the boundaries. How can we get from theory to action? How can we use technology for improving our businesses, our lives, and as well how we can actually act now. I struggle every day to find new solutions for me, to educate myself, to coach myself, and to coach my teams and my partners and my family. So one of the things that is key for everyone is education. Actually, you're going to be focusing much more on education on this channel. And of course, for today, I'm very excited to welcome, probably the biggest organization in the world, that is United Nations, through its department of Unesco. And today, my special guest is Dr. Sobhi Tawil, that is the director of the Futures of Learning and Innovation team at Unesco. So Dr. Sobhi currently leads the Futures of Education initiative, a project that, looking towards 2050, envisions possible futures in which education shapes a better world. A prominent figure within Unesco, Dr. Sobhi has taken different roles within the organization since 2002, always in the field of education. A PhD in Education and Development from Graduate Institute for International Developing Studies in Geneva, Dr. Tawil is a multicultural personality that worked and grew in multiple different countries and brings around 30 years of experience in teaching, education, policy analysis, research, and program management. Dr. Sobhi has worked with several institutions and organizations, including the International Committee of the Red Cross and Graduate Institute for International and Developing Studies at Geneva, as well as the Network for International Policies and Cooperation in Education and Training. As a renowned academic, he is widely published researcher on issues of education, policy in relation to identity-based conflict, social cohesion, and citizenship. He is, for example, the author of books like Education, Conflict and Social Cohesion, 2004, Éducation au Maroc, Analyse du secteur, 2010. So for the ones that don't understand French, Education in Morocco, Analysis of the Sector, and the technical report, Educational Destruction and Reconstruction in Disrupted Societies, Final Report and Case Studies, 1997, among others. His latest paper highlights the field of large-scale learning assessment, which is a key element for all of us. And his publication, The Promise of Large-Scale Learning Assessments, Acknowledge Limits to Unlock Opportunities, addresses the more contentious aspects of these standardized assessments. So in terms of the focus of this interview is highlighting the role of UNESCO in terms of education, as well as a lot of the different roles it's been having within UNESCO and this experience, but as well the challenge we're facing when it comes to education, to digital literacy, and AI, generative AI, and the impact of this, and a lot of metrics that most of you probably are not aware, because there's a lot of things happening, that a lot of numbers that are quite scary, and all of us have to act on this. Education is probably one of my biggest passions, and at the moment should be the passion for everyone. In a moment when we redefine what it means to be human with technology, education, culture, is still what defines us as humanity. So how can we be humanity in a time when we build machines that actually, in some ways, can actually become more powerful than us, at least in some areas? And how can we as well look at this challenge that we're facing as a civilization, as countries, as people, as families? So it's an honor to have you here, first of all.
Very pleased to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So you have a very ambitious role and, of course, a very important role for humanity. But at the same time, you actually have a background that comes from a lot of things that you did. Your profile is amazing, from your work as associate research, as an academic, as well a personality, and a lot of different things. But you have as well, of course, a background. So let's look for your background. So if you would look in your past and as well on your education, of course, what were the moments that made the person that you are today? I always like to go to this background.
No, thanks for that, Dinis. I think the first thing would be the diversity of the mixed background. I mean, I am of mixed background. I'm of Syrian and Swiss background, born in Damascus, brought up and schooled and educated in a range of countries: Lebanon, Nigeria, Malaysia, Laos, the US, Switzerland. And I think that exposed me, obviously, very early on and in my formative years, just to the diversity of human societies, of cultures, of ways of thinking. And that probably explained, even unconsciously, my interest in education and why I got into education, comparative education initially, and comparative education and development studies. Education is at the heart of every society. It is about the reproduction, transmission, transformation of societies, of their knowledge, of their specific and accumulated skills and values and beliefs. So really looking very broadly, I mean, it's how a society organizes its own reproduction and transformation. And I think that's really what got me into education. We see that obviously how education becomes, weaponized and politicized. Education is inherently, I would say, political, although in the international kind of development world, we tend to like to approach it as being purely technical. But we see it in situations of conflict, including in the Northern Hemisphere today in 2023, of politicizing, weaponizing education in different ways. So it is at the heart of our societies, and I think that my background is what brought me to education and education policy, and then my specialization in education and development initially. So I think that's one piece, the very personal kind of family trajectory and life trajectory, I would say, that got me into the area of education.
So if there was one moment in your education, because like you said, you have a fantastic wealth of knowledge, wealth of cultures. So you have to deal, I think most of the people don't have to deal with more than one culture. There's one operating system that is probably the cultural background of the person. But in your case, like you said, you are a citizen of the world from all the different backgrounds. So it was the moment in your education, it was a teacher, it was one university in particular, or a set of things that made you the passion and as well the dedication, the research that you brought to education?
Yeah, that would probably be in undergraduates in sociology and anthropology of education. That for me was the inspiration and the connection with my life experience. I studied essentially at the University of Geneva in my undergraduate. That was in French. And in sociology, we're referred to l'arbitraire culturel. I mean, this that any culture is like in a sense, a subjective subset of the whole scope of possible human values and beliefs. And when I first came across that, I said, well, that is something I understood and experienced very young, thinking of, being 9 or 10 or 11 in somewhere like Kuala Lumpur, a city where you are immediately exposed to, 3 major religions, languages, which all comprise, the Malaysian identity. And so I understood that something that I had lived and experienced. I understood the concept before cognitively understanding it, if you want. So that was I think that was perhaps the most, in terms of the moments in academic, that sort of got my that got me interested, really, in education and in this way. It's true that in my life trajectory, I also went through different kind of education systems. So was also exposed to very different, ways of organizing education, and approaches to, student learner development. I would say from a more, liberal American, student-centered, learner-centered, empowering kind of education, to more traditional conservative, submissive types of educational experiences. So I think those were, but the academic moment was that, I think, in really sociology of education, that really sparked my interest in moving into the world, I would say, of education and development. I wasn't thinking UNESCO or the UN system, but I guess my trajectory, both personal and academic, led me there, somehow naturally.
It's amazing, and it really, I love your wealth of knowledge. For people listening to us, most of the people really can really have to think out of the box to digest this multiplicity of identities, of, like you said, conservative liberal education. And I think this is very important for the moment we are. So another thing that is probably one of your biggest achievements, and of course you are an author and a writer and researcher. So you've been publishing a very wealth of books like Education, Conflict and Social Cohesion, and in 2004, Education au Maroc, that is a publication more focused about Morocco, The Redesign of Pedagogy in Algeria, Education, Diversity and Social Cohesion. And of course, you've been as well very important articles about international humanitarian law and basic education. So do you want to, of course, we could go for much more.
I see you've done your background, your preparation.
Yeah, so just in terms of highlights here, because of course we cannot go in this interview to go for all of this, but before we go to the UNESCO, a bit of your background as an author and as a writer as well, what some of the common parts, of course, that you want to touch here and highlight for our audience?
Maybe again, linked to my own trajectory. I did a piece now about 10 years ago, but when this was being coined, the global citizenship education. Some would call this a fuzzword, more than a buzzword, that it's a notion and not a concept. It's a bit like the concept of time. If you say, what is time? Everyone understands. But if you say, explain it, it's a little more difficult. And but one understands the importance and the relevance of it in our increasingly interconnected world, interconnected because of technology that has reduced time and space in our relationships, in our communication, but also because of the growing, economic integration of the. But the concept is perhaps not ideal in its framing. I would rather think of or suggest, thinking in terms of citizenship education, because it remains the prerogative of nation states, even if we are moving to a more globalized world. But it's about citizenship education in an increasingly globalized world, so that there is increasing recognition that we have shared challenges and opportunities and aspirations, and that some of the challenges facing us today are obviously of a global and planetary nature. The most obvious is around environment and the climate. But also we see now with technology, the need for regulation, that it's no longer about nation state regulation. To some degree, yes, but there needs to be also regulation at global level, whether we're thinking about the movements of people, migration, or a range of issues. So this idea of citizenship education in an increasingly globalized world. So how do we maintain our specific kind of identity, culture, and that unique contribution that we can make while also being global citizens? And I think that's a little bit the balance. And I think UNESCO, just to connect with that, I think has, we speak of our common humanity, and we value cultural diversity. When we speak of cultural heritage, and that's what perhaps UNESCO is most well known for, because it's the most visible part of our work, perhaps. One thinks of World Heritage Sites, and one can see UNESCO, logos and emblems on that. But the idea that the world is a cultural mosaic, and it's that mosaic that makes up our common humanity. And I think this links, I just think this, with my own trajectory, having thought about identity, personal, individual, collective, I thought it resonated very well also with the writings of a French-Lebanese author who is now the permanent secretary of the l'Académie Française, the French Academy, Amin Maalouf, who had a small book of his many, many books on identity. I'm not sure what the translation is in French, but identité meurtrière. And I thought he had an interesting distinction between identity is a unique individual. There are only individual identities on this planet. With the billions of people that we have, each one is an individual identity. And each individual identity is composed of multiple affiliations. So we feel this, of a religion, of an ideology, of a language community, whatever it may be, of a professional, association. We have multiple affiliations that we kind of categorize in certain ways, that our ranking of the importance of these different affiliations for ourselves might evolve in life. And all of that is part of the wealth, the cultural diversity, this mosaic of humanity, on condition that our first affiliation is to the human race. So to this common humanity, as long as we first define ourselves as being humans, and then we can define ourselves culturally, linguistically, religiously, ideologically, all the rest becomes the richness of this mosaic. So that's, I think, where UNESCO comes in with a very strong message of our common humanity that values diversity. I mean, we could link that immediately to the generative AI, if you want, which is one aspect of, beyond the potential, benefits and opportunities and challenges for education. There is a larger issue around the knowledge commons, if you want, and the way that artificial intelligence and the data that it is trained on and where that data originates from might end up actually narrowing this wealth and richness and diversity of our knowledge commons, which is the cumulative heritage, if you want, of all human societies over time. I mean, just thinking that some 80%, we have like 7,000 languages, living languages, as we would say at UNESCO. But maybe only 8 to 10 of these, which are actually, represented in the knowledge on the internet. Some 80% of websites can be attributed to about 8 of these 7,000 languages. So the way in which we are narrowing, and if we look at the training of generative AI tools and models, where's that coming from, including with the values, the worldviews, the stereotypes and the biases we know, that we are training these generative AI tools with. So here, my little segue on the technology aspect of that, our common humanity, but valuing diversity of worldviews, diversity of knowledge systems, linguistic diversity, and diversity of ways of knowing and being. And this increasingly is important in today's world, where we have these collective shared challenges. We need actually more diversity to be more innovative and creative in our responses and our ways of addressing, whether it's climate change or other shared challenges we have.
No, I want to, because I think you touch a key element, especially with generative AI. But before going there, I would like for people listening to us, and I definitely have a lot of questions on this. That's probably another podcast. But before that, so as the director of Future of Learning and Innovation team at UNESCO, where you currently lead the Future of Education Initiative, a project that is looking towards 2050, and you touch a lot of things right now that is there. But for people that don't know so much, because of course you are deeply involved with UNESCO, tell us a bit about your role and UNESCO, because I think that's a very important people for, first of all, one of the things I learned in my, and I like this for people listening to us, is that people know things exist, but like you said, it's like the language. There's 5 or 6 languages or 7. Actually, that's a very important thing for technologists. But in the end of the day, the diversity and as well understanding the fantastic work that we have, because the media doesn't highlight any of this. So if you could highlight that.
Okay. So that could be also a separate discussion on its own, but maybe useful to recall. I mean, people generally might not know. I mean, the UN and UNESCO in particular was founded just after the Second World War. So after that terrible experience around the world. And one of the most cited articles of the Constitution of UNESCO, just to give the spirit of its birth, is to say, and if one visits the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, they will see that next to an olive tree in the garden, symbol of peace, that since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that we must construct the defenses of peace. So this is like the founding article, if you want, that gives the spirit of the mission of UNESCO. And this peace was seen as being based on the moral and intellectual solidarity of humankind. So through scientific cooperation, cooperation in the areas of science, of culture, and of education. And that's what the 3 E for education, S for science, and the C for culture in UNESCO, the UN Agency for Education, Science, and Culture. So that was the spirit, constructing the defenses of peace through, based on a principle of moral, intellectual solidarity, and fostering cooperation in the areas of education, culture, and science. So the work of UNESCO in these areas, there are several broad functions, I would say, and this would help to explain also what we do specifically in Future of Education. One we call a laboratory of ideas, a kind of observatory function. So it's looking at societal change, different dimensions of societal change, and convening. We are an international organization, so all countries are represented. UNESCO is all the countries represented. That's what it is. It can come together and look and agree, debate, and hopefully agree and reach consensus on implications of different aspects of societal change, and directions that we should take. So that's from the observatory function. We would come to a second function, which is a more normative kind of function of reaching consensus on norms and guidance on, in general, with an ethical lens, and I think specifically on artificial intelligence. In 2021, UNESCO developed a recommendation through this debate, intensive debate among experts, but also among all the countries represented, a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And so to guide any development, engagement in any sector with these new generations of AI systems. So that's a function around the normative, if you want, and there is a function around policy support. Typically in education, UNESCO would be working with ministries of education at the system level, so strengthening policy, planning, and this can cut across all levels of education, from early learning to school education, to higher education, to adult education, literacy programs, vocational skills development. So these are, I would say, these are some of the functions. And what we do in the future of learning and innovation, we are within the education sector at UNESCO considered to be the kind of think tank to generate ideas, to be monitoring. Most recently, some of you may be familiar with, because it was quite a bit on the media, with the COVID disruption, we had this massive global shutdown of school systems and universities initially. And we monitored that from March 2020. And we warned quite early on about the potential implications and adverse effects of prolonged closures of educational institutions. So that kind of mapping, this monitoring, the recent work we did on the Futures of Education initiative, which was we had both an international commission of some 18 personalities of different walks of life, thinking about looking at a 2050 horizon, not about predicting what education will look like in 2050, but looking longer term. And I think that's what an observatory function is really about. It's we tend to be caught up in our day-to-day work, whatever that may be. And from time to time, we need to just pause for a moment, lift our heads and look longer, further, both looking back, I would say, and looking at longer trends to understand why we are where we are, what got us here, good and bad, and looking longer term. And that's why we set the 2050. It also represents 30 years from about the time the initiative was, which is like a generation. So what will the world look like in a generation? And what do we want the world to look like in a generation? And what does that mean for education? And our initial work on the futures of education, we reviewed, existing debates and literature on anything about the future of learning, the future of education, the future of knowledge. And a few things came out, but one thing that was quite clear is most of that literature, 3/4, 80%, was framed in terms of the world around us is changing because of technology, and therefore the labor markets, and therefore the way we work and live, and as a result, education needs to change to adapt to that. And education is a slow-moving machine. It's always a little bit behind the changes. So most of that discourse was about education needing to adapt to changes around us. But I think the interest of looking, a bit more forward-looking, more foresight at 2050 is to say, on the basis of current trends, what is the world likely to look like in 2050? Is that the way we want it to look? And if not, maybe it's about how does a different kind of education, how can it help us shape an alternative future that would take us in a more sustainable direction, perhaps in a more inclusive and just direction. But in any case, that would ensure kind of more sustainable alternative futures that we want. So just to end on that, that's one. I think the second piece on future and future of education is that most of that debate is in more developed countries. Because in less developed countries, we would say there's still a huge challenge in terms of, ensuring literacy of the majority, ensuring, enrollment of young people and preparation of such a, Africa, as you mentioned, being, having now the largest share of young people of all regions of the world. So a very young population, so there are these immediate challenges that there's perhaps less of a luxury to be looking at, the future and what needs to change. I think the work that we did with this with the Futures of Education initiative, and which was picked up and used to frame the UN effort around the Transforming Education Summit, is that we need to transform education. And transform is not reform. Reform is, some improvements maybe on the periphery, tinkering a little bit with the system, making it a little bit better. Transform means a more kind of fundamental change. It doesn't mean starting from scratch. We have strengths to build on, but transform would also mean a kind of critical examination of what is really not working. And maybe despite our best intentions, but some things are taking us in the wrong direction in education. We often say education is a solution for everything. greater productivity, it's investment in human capital. It is, more healthier families. It's like the black box solution to everything. But one could also say it might also be part of the problem. The way we do education might be part of the problem. If we look at climate change, the most educated societies, the most educated persons, us perhaps, here in this discussion, are among those who are contributing the most to climate change. So, it's not a cause and effect, but there are some positive correlations which can be worrying. Just to take that example, but one could also look at it, and we mentioned earlier about, the political aspects of education and how it can be weaponized. That some types of education may contribute also or help fuel polarization of our societies, division, and undermining social cohesion. So that we need transform means a more fundamental change than reform. We have strengths to build on, but we also have to critically examine some of what is not working. And we need to transform, I would say, for two reasons. And one is, it's like having a foot in the past and a foot in the future. The foot in the past is we still have more than 770 million adults who are non-literate. We're in 2023. We're in a digital age. How can we have hundreds of millions of adults in the world today who cannot access or communicate based on writing of any language? So something perhaps is not working. If we look at upper secondary education, completion, the world average is more or less 50%. 1 in 2 students who is in upper secondary education does not complete the level. There may be many reasons. There can be harassment at school, bullying, there might be a shock in the family, a change of, but it cannot explain that 1 in 2 students who are already in upper second do not complete that level. So this model, something is not working in the model. We need to admit that and to look at it. Maybe it's our methods, the content, what we're teaching and how we're trying to teach and is perhaps not relevant anymore to young people, in particular in this digital age. Perhaps they see less connection with what they're doing, in secondary school with their realities, their immediate realities, and their own perceptions of the future. So this is part of the transform. Transform, a more fundamental change. It means looking at what that 1 foot in the past, this continued exclusion from education, something is not working. That is reason enough that we transform education. But the second reason is looking at the future. If we look at 2050 and we say, where are we going? Where are we headed on the basis of, a projection of current trends? And that education might actually be part of the problem, propelling us on these trends, then we also need to transform education in order to shape alternative futures. So this is some of the work that we have been doing, and then more recently, we've always been involved in technology and education, but we might get to that in a minute. But obviously, much more focus on that very recently with, just the way, generative AI kind of burst onto the public scene. And media attention and public debate, in particular with the release of ChatGPT-4. It's been around for a while, but let's say in the last 6 months, since the end of last year, that was on everyone's mind. So our work is not limited to, but there has been a lot of recent focus, obviously, on technological innovations and what that means for education and for the future of education.
Yeah, you touch an amazing amount that is making me think, and I'm sure all our audience, and I think probably we need a pause to just digest, because it first of all, you mentioned the biggest trends in education worldwide. The biggest challenge I didn't know, for instance, is just the fact that in 2 young people, 1 doesn't finish the studies. That's quite damaging. And as well, 10% of the world population, that's 750 million or more, don't have basic actually learning digital skills. Actually, I'm not talking digital skills, basic learning education, because digital skills is another one. Basic skills, yeah. So I think for people listening to us, because I want to make this as well very practical for everyone listening to us. So in the publications that UNESCO has been doing, which you've been involved with your team and other teams, I will highlight just some of them, and I will put this very highlighted. We're going to take a lot of excerpts from this interview. So you mentioned an EdTech tragedy. There's a new book about experience with educational technologies. There is a new book about the COVID-19 experience for people listening to us, because you mentioned that. There's a guide to generative AI, which I suggest everyone to look at it because it's key. Then there's as well the Future of Education Initiative, which you mentioned as well. All of these are papers available for free that everyone can go, because I think people are missing this. Then the Future of Education Initiative, Rethinking Education, Reimagining Our Futures Together. Just some publications that I know that are important for UNESCO and your work. So let's go to the biggest elephant in the room, because we have only 10 minutes according to your time of 15. I want to be respectful. Yeah. So you touch generative AI, and that's one of the questions I've been asking, I guess, whatever they are, startups of Fortune 500 or ministers. I've been having a couple of ministers, including ministers of a very high, actually, today I interviewed a minister. One of the challenge I face, now this is a direct question that, the research you guys are doing is amazing. There's no question. Whatever you are, right, left, this is great for humanity, and that's it. Of course, then you can go for, like you said, for all the nuances, but definitely there's a big challenge because I give you two examples, and this is a complex question, but I want to touch because if there's someone that can touch it, is you. First, I did a big project in São Paulo, and the project was actually doing a technology solution for one of the worst neighborhoods in São Paulo, which is the Bairros de Lata, for the ones that speak a bit of Brazilian or Portuguese. And this is really the most hardcore. And like you said, a lot of people, the finding I found was a lot of people did not read, so they use WhatsApp voice to communicate with other people,
right?
Because they could not rest, they could not test. Then another project was in Mauritania, so two parts of the world that have difficulties. Mauritania, I built a project for the central bank, actually, Mauritania, for a social a financial cooperative. And I found as well, going to the country from the desert to different parts, everyone had two phones, a mobile phone and then a smartphone. The mobile phone because it can go for a week because they don't have electricity, but smartphone to have WhatsApp and to talk with their families and so forth. So effectively, we have, in one end, this amazing amount of technology, which I'm part of it, I'm building it, whereas metaverse, immersive, and that's 2.5, actually 3.2 billion people living in gaming experience every day. So we have a really complex landscape that is a paradox. And as well, of course, right now we question AI. So in your research, you mentioned 2050. At the moment, for instance, we have as well another, and sorry, I'm putting a lot of things, but I want to touch to push the audience as well. And I want like my audience to engage as well going forward. Is the challenge right now that I feel is about the narrative about humanity, like you mentioned, and as well how we can get like these different things, because in the end of the day, everyone is using these tools, technology tools. But like you said, there's a failure from the institutions to, first of all, engage all these people. And as well, of course, to creating a new divide that is more complex to describe. But from your experience in education, let's go back to basics, because the challenges, the research is done. You guys have the best research in the planet. And from your experience, work with a lot of governments, universities, experts, media, what would be one of the, I know that there's no silver bullets, but what would be one of the things we could do to really reverse engineer this? Because it's getting worse, especially at the moment, Silicon Valley, and I'll finish with this. Silicon Valley, and I'll quote, is a lot of people are thinking that we should destroy humanity the next 50 years, like it happened during the third industrial revolution, actually the second industrial revolution and the third. And then in 50 years, humanity will be a new one. So this is not me, okay? I don't believe in this, but this is what is happening right now. A lot of technology players with, of course, AI becoming sentient as well, which is another thing. So I know that this is a very big question, but that's what you do in your research. How do you see this, and how can we get out of, first of all, the narrative and try to get into something that can make a change?
The relationship between education and technology evolves. It has evolved. I mean, we just look at our lifetimes. Not sure how old you are, Dinis, but if I look at myself and then and then some of the people around me, I mean, we've in our own lifetimes gone through a few major, technological transformations. I mean, first the personal computer, the expansion, and then the expansion of the internet, and then the mobile phone, and social media, and now AI and generative AI. And so for education, it has been challenging. We did have, you mentioned ministers. We had in May of this year a virtual consultation with ministers from around the world on how they see, this was May 2023, so how they're seeing ChatGPT-4, but the range of generative AI tools. And there was, perhaps surprisingly, what could be qualified a kind of cautious optimism, and this among ministers of education, that there is real potential there, but also caution, because we know that even those who are designing these technologies do not and will admit to not fully understanding how they function, nor the complete implications. And so I think what is, and we heard the call for a kind of a pause on development beyond ChatGPT-4, that from a few months ago. But the fact that an untested, let's say, powerful technology was just made publicly available, is one thing. I mean, one could continue research on this. And I mean, if we think, just to compare, I mean, the question of a lack of, I mean, there's uncharted territory because there is lack of regulation. This is coming into place now, whether it's, relative to data protection, privacy, whether on copyright, because we know that a lot of the training of these generative AI tools is using material without, the consent of authors. So it's there are, multiple lawsuits also on non-respect of intellectual property rights. There's also a new challenge on what is the status of what is produced by generative AI tools, whether creations, images, or text. What's the copyright status? What's the of them? But we know that this has all come out in terms of if we think of with no regulation. Think of medicine. Think of processed food. Think of toys. I mean, there are regulations in place. One cannot just unleash a new, not fully tested medicine, into the public. I mean, here we're talking, and you've mentioned it. I mean, we the extremes of the debates on generative AI and sentience, and what will come and what might come, and then no one knows. And there's a mix of awe, bewilderment, fear, uncertainty, amazement. But this lack of regulation, I think one of our main messages at UNESCO is, while there may be potential for education, and there is, we have seen already some of it even before the generative AI, thinking of, without overdoing it, but the personalized learning within a certain limit is definitely an opportunity in education, the ability to automate certain tasks for teachers and kind of free them of some administrative tasks, and therefore free them, for more meaningful engagement. I'm thinking also of, and perhaps that's one of the most beneficial already on even before the generative AI, but learners with disabilities or learners with difficulties. There's a number of applications that either the instantaneous translation, reading of text, for those with visual impairments, or there are tools also on detecting reading levels, attainment, difficulties, on detecting dyslexia. So there are many uses that have already been there. But there is now, with this latest uncharted territory and a lack of regulation, a lack of guidance. We did a quick survey at UNESCO among our networks of, we have what we call associated schools around the world, and we have university chairs around the world. We did a quick survey. We got 450 responses, half schools, half universities. This was May of this year. Do you have any guidance, institutionally or beyond, on what to do? I mean, use this, how to use this, at what level? Should you use this with children or only at higher levels of education? Fewer than 10% had received any guidance on what to do. In a few cases, it was do not use, as in banned by the faculty, the department, whatever. In other cases, it was, use at your discretion. But basically to say that 90% were given no guidance. And we do know that there are risks. There are risks which always existed. We've seen it with social media, have existed with AI, but now also with conversational platforms for young children. There are risks of manipulation. There are risks of being pulled into inappropriate conversations. So kind of unguided, free conversation with some of these generative AI platforms, to have these conversations, can take very young people in very wrong directions, in dangerous directions. They are also given the kind of legitimacy of the responses we get from generative AI tools. Younger learners are also not always capable of understanding this is a machine, and it is based purely on statistical probability and sequencing of words, and that there is no understanding. I mean, what you're getting from a generative AI tool, it's a machine. It has no understanding of the world. It is producing something that in most cases is coherent, in some cases is inaccurate, but in most cases summarizes well, produces well, can offer courses of action, but that it is based on no direct experience of reality, right? So that's why in our guidance we have also encourage countries that they should set an age limit on at least free conversation of children. I mean, unaccompanied, if you want, with generative AI conversational platforms at least 13. I mean, if we look at the European Union, in the US, around social media, there are, it ranges from 13 to 16 that without parental authority or guidance, they should not be using these tools. We know that it's very easy to get around them. I mean, click that you're, confirm that you're 16 years or older. You just click. I mean, there's still an issue there on how we implement. So that's one in terms of the risk. So it is kind of surprising. Our Assistant Director General recently put out a short piece, and she's right that, textbooks, for example, we cannot just introduce any textbooks into schools. There's a whole process of validation. Are they pedagogically appropriate? Are they age appropriate? Are they scientifically accurate? Do they kind of convey the values and, the social norms of the context? And here, all of a sudden, we have a powerful knowledge tool, the most powerful we have seen, with absolutely no steps on validating. So this was one, is that we do need regulation, and we do need some guidance. There is setting the age limits. There is, which is beyond education, there is revising copyright laws. There is revising and updating data privacy laws. But having said that, on the more, I don't want to say positive side, because we often, opportunities and challenges, we have a very kind of binary outlook. But the fact, as you were saying, the generative AI tools can mimic and replicate some of, human capacity, language ability, poses kind of more fundamental questions, like you were saying at the very beginning, about what it means to be human, what is the specificity of human intelligence, and therefore the purpose of education. I mean, what does an educated person mean? So there are issues, that the first reactions in the education world, and you are you are in academia yourself, was around cheating and around, assignments and cheating and is this so we know of some academics who will now say use tools like ChatGPT, but show me how you have taken it further. Have you been able to check for the accuracy of references? Because we also know what are referred to as hallucinations. Even what look like scientific references, academic references, can be completely made up. One would actually need to look to find if they really exist, for example, or what are you adding to what, So there are useful, there is an opportunity. We were talking about it earlier, when we said COVID disrupted our systems, and there was an opportunity to kind of fundamentally rethink, how we do education, basically. What we teach, how we learn, how we assess and validate learning. This, I think, is now, it's not only inviting us to do it, we have to do it. Whether generative AI is used as a tool in education or not, it now exists as a technology in our societies. So in education, what should we be focusing on? I think one important point, we've seen it on many debates on digital learning. There's a kind of, these debates are kind of blind to age. But when we talk about digital in education, are we talking about a 5-year-old? Are we talking about a 10-year-old? Are we talking about a 15, 16-year-old, an adolescent, and the whole social peer pressure and the role of social media? Or are we talking about a 25-year-old at university? It's a very different. So I think generative AI has it has potential to usefully disrupt upper secondary education and higher education, I would say. And we should probably leave primary education, elementary kind of alone. It's not so much for integrating generative AI there, but we know that at higher levels, it can be a useful tool for brainstorming, obviously generating outlines and starting points for research, for the Socratic learning, and kind of further developing. And teachers can use, to at least generate initial, lesson plans and kind of what we call co-design curricula. There are uses there. I think my last point on this would be, and the most strategic area in education, in educational transformation, innovation, is like assessment and validation of learning. One paradox, if we think about the internet, let's go back 15 years, and we could think the same now about generative AI, a new technology. But about 15 years back, what a paradox in education that we always say we need to develop the digital skills of learners and of teachers because we live in a digital era, because we live with technology and the internet for information, internet for entertainment, at work. We plan our holidays. We do everything. And so we say in education, we must be building digital skills. But when it comes to examinations, what paradox that as a rule, it is prohibited to access the internet during your examination. So while in life we use this, at work, we're given a problem to solve, we immediately go to the internet. So we have this paradox of here's a technology that exists in society, but the way we assess learning is not integrating this new reality. So now with generative AI, I think is an excellent moment to be rethinking how we validate, how we assess, and how we really validate learning. And in doing that, we're really asking the question, what is the important learning? What are really the competencies and skills that we should be developing today, given that generative AI I mean, we could, is capable of doing much of the lower order thinking skills, if you want. And therefore, where do we focus? We focus on these higher order skills. How do we use the tool, for example, as we said in Socratic learning or whatever, to actually help develop these types of skills? So that's, I think, on the opportunity side. Yes, tools in particular areas, and alleviating some tasks and whatever of teachers, but I think more fundamentally and more interestingly, forcing us to fundamentally think about how we want to transform education, not how it is going to transform us, but how we want to transform education in a society and a future that is increasingly integrating AI, has already integrated AI in so many aspects of our life. And we don't even know what new generations of AI systems are coming, maybe even in the next 18 months or 24 months.
Yeah, I think you touched really a wealth of, first of all, of tools and I would say as well, ways for us to act. I think, like you said, I think the challenge right now is how schools, universities, and can actually act on this. Because in fact, like you said, we just launched, there was something saying that this is the open eye moment of humanity with AI. And as well, it is really in some ways much more radical, because, okay, an atomic bomb, you launch it and you destroy everything. Here, you create something that no one comes, and the destruction it's in a lot of layers of humans. So I'm cautious of your time. I know that we passed the time. So one last question, and probably more from your input, just for our audience. So we have an audience of business and technology. This is a channels that touch the two areas, but everyone is doing some kind of education, and most of my audience is quite well educated. But of course, everyone is struggling. Like you said, if 90% of the organizations that you've been engaged don't know how to act to this, I'm sure most of the people don't know how big this is as well, because they don't go on the layers that you and me are going through the research and in our work. But from this work of UNESCO, your work as well, what would be the message you pass through? And definitely the tools, I will put all these links. I want to make sure that everyone reads, because it's actually excellent content. An ed tech strategy touches a lot of these things, but of course AI goes another step. So what would be the recommendations for this first one? I'm sure we'll do a match too, but I would like, at least within the time you have, recommendations that you have, very concrete things, of course, besides reading and studying this.
Maybe an opportunity to mention one more important piece that came out this July. It's not from our team, but it's one of the flagship reports of UNESCO education. It's an annual, we call it the Global Education Monitoring Report. It actually looks at progress annually on progress towards internationally agreed goals and targets around education, and each year has a theme. This year's theme was on education and technology. It did not, because most of the drafting kind of happened before the release of ChatGPT-4 and that media frenzy, let's say, and so it deals a bit less with that, but it does look more comprehensively at the experience and different facets of technology, and including obviously digital technology, but not only, and education. The main message there, or the subtitle, was a tool on our own terms. And I think one of the main messages from all of the work that we're doing is not to forget that whatever technology we're talking about, they are tools for education, to support education. And they are not ends and goals in themselves. There is, as we know, and in the EdTech tragedy, we look at that, there's a lot of what some have called technology solutionism, and that has been transferred also to education, that any problem you may have in education, technology will help to solve it. And their message was that some technology works for some educational purposes in some contexts. So, I mean, basically to say we need a more nuanced view. So technology in education on our terms, meaning that education should not lose sight, or educators should not lose sight of the purpose and goals that they set, and then for them to decide and be able, and that's where professional development comes in, to decide on what technologies to support them in what ways to, in pursuit of their educational goals and the purposes they have assigned, rather than bend to the logic of technology. I mean, education should not. So that's a main message there. We use in what we call Digital Learning Week, which we organized early September last month. We simply say steering technology for education. We had in 2021 worked at the Rewired Education Summit. We came up with a declaration on connectivity in education with three simple principles, and I think they're kind of very useful guides also for the use of technology and digital technology in education. The three principles. The first principle was to center the most marginalized. Most technological innovation in education before COVID used to happen on the periphery, if you want. Either more privileged settings, more privileged institutions, more privileged teachers and communities and learners and families, kind of experimenting with technology to improve the quality, the relevance of educational experiences or the efficiency. The other end of the periphery was to be thinking technology to reach the unreached, so using mobile technology to reach, semi-literate adolescent girls in a rural, remote region of some country. Since COVID, that has changed. Technology, there is no policy discussion in education at any level that does not also discuss technology. But this first principle is to say, let's reverse this. You first try it kind of with the more privileged and then hope it trickles down to everyone, and to say you center the most marginalized. So technological innovation for educational purposes, if it works with the more disadvantaged groups of learners, it's a fairer way of introducing technological innovation at scale in education. That's the first principle. This center the most marginalized, not like an afterthought, but actually start with designing technological interventions and solutions that work either for linguistic minorities, learners with disabilities, whatever it may be, whatever the factors of disadvantage may be. If it works for them, it will work for the majority and can therefore be scaled out rather than scaled up in a fairer way. That's the first principle. Second is that we need, and we have an initiative on this with UNICEF. This is more on school education, but we need to strengthen public digital learning platforms. What we saw with COVID is that there might be a lot of content out there, but it's scattered, it's fragmented, not all of it is open or free, not all of it is aligned with national curricula standards. And so we need platforms are important, platforms that public learning platforms that have functionalities for learners, for teachers, for families and caregivers, who ensure that the learning content is appropriate, pedagogically appropriate, age appropriate, quality assured, that it is to the extent possible, free, open source, and that we have a clear destination in the same way that we have public educational television or radio. We should have a public space on the internet for educational purposes. So this is a second principle around the, building or refining public digital learning platforms. If a share of the materials are open source, platforms can connect and borrow and adapt materials from others and translate them and, adapt them to their context. So a bit of the sense of what we started with of international cooperation and solidarity. And that's, I think, what's marvelous about digital learning resources in the digital commons. I mean, can be shared and continuously enriched. And the third principle, and we often overlook it, is that kind of digital transformation of education requires, encourages pedagogical transformation. In many contexts, too many contexts, we think, oh, we're digitizing textbooks and, we're putting them online, or so it's like transferring existing models to the virtual. But the digital technologies, what they represent as possibilities in education for innovating in pedagogy, in the educational experience and the relevance of that experience, is very much underutilized. So many, education systems will say, okay, we're investing in infrastructure and access to, laptops, to computers, maybe to digital training, but in a technical dimension, we need to develop the digital skills. But not to forget that in education, it is opening new windows for pedagogical innovation, and that's a key piece that's often overlooked. So centering the most marginalized, kind of strengthening public digital learning platforms, and then not forgetting that digital innovation requires and allows and encourages pedagogical innovation, which is really what we need to move away from models which are often still a replication of what we've been doing for, decades, if not centuries, in some instances.
No, I want to thank you. It's we passed the time a bit, but there's still much more questions. So we're going to, I think, for people listening to us, what I suggest is please study these documents, listen to the work of Dr. Sobhi and all the teams that are doing fantastic research, and as well act. Like you said, a lot of these things is about action. And I think one of the challenges, for me, probably the biggest challenge is how we create digital transformation, but as well digital identity and digital continuous education and coaching, because that's another challenge that is critical, because that's the problem, is that most of our leaders have no clue about digital or technology, which is difficult. This is difficult. Even for people like us, it's difficult. So imagine for the rest of the people. But like you said, we just opened the Pandora box. Now we have to find ways of making sure the Pandora box is still under control. I don't know if there's any final words you want to do to our audience. I'm very grateful for your fantastic insights and wealth of data and research that you shared with us.
No, just to thank you for this opportunity to share. One thing we did say in the Futures of Education initiative, you'll notice in the title, reimagining our futures together. And that increasingly, and I think UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has spoken of a new social contract, not in the old, classical sense of Rousseau's state and citizen, but rather that we need to be more horizontal. We need all constituencies involved in the transformation of education. It's not just top down, nor just bottom up. It's all constituencies, all voices, like you say, need to act in their area of, in their space of action, and within the limits of their capacity, but that we need all involved in a dynamic to transform education. So just to thank you for also connecting with your audience in this discussion. Really appreciate that.
My honor. And I think just to highlight, read an EdTech strategy. There's a lot of things about the guide for generative AI, 44 pages that you can see. The Future of Education Initiative, Rethinking Education, Reimagining Our Futures Together. I love the work that you guys did about thinking about 2050. All of this is in the website of Unesco. We'll put all the links here. Please engage. There's no excuses. Okay, it's all in our hands as well. Thank you so much.